Welcome and thank you very much for your interest in this contribution on the potential of administrative informatics in policy research, which was submitted in the context of the Data for Policy Europe conference. This video was therefore recorded on the 2nd of June. My name is Sander Frank and I'm currently a research associate and PhD candidate at Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen, Germany. I studied politics, administration and international relations, and I'm part of the Open Government Institute, which is directed by the co-author of this contribution, Professor Dr. Jörn von Lücke. He also holds the chair of Administrative and Business Informatics at Zeppelin University, Friedrichshafen. The Open Government Institute has been engaged in a wide range of fields for many years. The Institute addresses questions surrounding the implications of administrative digitalization and the associated societal transformations. The latest information and research publications can always be found on the Institute's homepage. For example, the recently published guidelines on AI in parliaments. Looking at today's agenda, we will begin with an introduction where we take a closer look at the key elements of this work. Next, we present the aims of the paper to more precisely define its scope. This is followed by a description of the highly complex research environment to better contextualize the field in which our study is situated. This, of course, includes an explanation of the chosen methodology and approach. We end with results and limitations. Our submission is titled Potentials of Administrative Informatics for the Analysis of Policymaking. Notes on the integration of administrative informatics into the policy cycle. This submission focuses on developing a heuristic to integrate administrative informatics into the policy cycle. In doing so, administrative informatics is intended to be further legitimized as a perspective within policy research. The contribution also wants to generate new insights for analyzing policy-making processes. This was to be examined in the context of the European green transition. In other words, within the idea of a simultaneous transformation in digitalization and sustainability. We therefore also need to take a closer look at the research objective. Using administrative informatics as a perspective within policy research is therefore meant to help expand our understanding of modern policy making in the context of the green transition. The paper follows the argument that this integrated perspective can generate important findings on how policymaking is changing through digitalization and what implications this has for the twin transition. Through the development of a heuristic, we aim to create accessibility to these questions. The heuristic should therefore deliver a usable model that allows for the evaluation and comparability of specific questions concerning different elements of the twin transition. For instance, how policymaking changes in the context of sustainable transport, energy policy, or heat planning through a digitalized state is to be made more tangible through the proposed model of thinking and linking. We are therefore deliberately operating within the framework of the twin transition, which aims to think digitalization and sustainability as a linked interest. For the present investigation, it should be noted that we focus on political shaping of ecological sustainability. That means questions of climate neutrality through the digitalization of the state and administration. The field of application in the paper was thus more narrowly defined than the twin transition itself is, as it is broadly applied and thought in case of economy, society, state and administration as well. Nevertheless, the goal of the heuristic remains to provide a point of reference and insight for a broader range of research questions within the research field of the twin transition. Let us now move for the research environment and contextual conditions that arise for the objective that is now described. First, we can state that administrative informatics defines itself as an interdisciplinary research field. Not only does it connect administrative science and computer science, but also has roots in sociology, political science, law, economics, and other social science, creating a broad spectrum in methodology and in research subjects. We locate a strong grounding in political science and see this overlap in design and application-oriented questions. Administrative informatics thus aim to analyze and design processes. This process-oriented thinking also frequently includes phases or moments of policymaking. Administration is therefore one of the three pillars in the construction of democratic states. A strict dichotomy or functional separation between these three pillars, and therefore a strict separation between administrative science and political science, is questioned in academic discourses unless it's purposefully applied through research design and gained evidence. We can also observe that public administration is under a certain transformational pressure. On the one hand, due to ongoing digitalization, on the other hand, due to climate change and its tangible impacts based on the irreversible circumstances, but also due to many other effects like demographic change or conflict, which increasingly challenge the state. The public sector or the state bears the responsibility to shape disruption and respond to these processes in the line with the democratically legitimized will of the population. The state must also use resources as efficiently and effectively as possible, also in line with the democratic will. This is therefore also a subject of administrative informatics and the idea of understanding the administration and politics as interlocking entities. These have mutual dependencies and influences. The idea of examining the linkage between digitalization and sustainability derives partly from the desire to realize synergies and avoid adverse or contradictory effects. The synergy approach asks in a bidirectional way about mutual influences and opportunities. Adverse or contradictory effects include classical rebound effects, such as rising or stagnant greenhouse gas emissions despite improved energy efficiency. Lock-in effects that hinder the transition to more sustainable or digital methods and processes should also be avoided and improved. What we mean by this is that digitalization should not simply be advanced in ways that serves its own purpose, but also fulfill a sustainable ambition and goal. The topic is well recognized in academic discourse and addresses from various perspectives. However, that remains a lack of findings that take a specific look at the digitalization of the public sector. European twin transition has already been addressed by the Joint Research Centre of the European Union and produced a guide that outlines the key requirements for a functioning European twin transition. The document sees itself as a document to support the policy process of the twin transition and explicitly states that administrative staff were involved in the foresight process. However, even here, public administration is only partially identified as a key actor or addresser of the twin transition. The European twin transition is not a single document or strategy that runs consistently through all federal levels. It consists of many different blocks and strategies. For example, the European Green Deal, the European Data Strategy, the Digital Compass. Energy efficiency through digitalization was also an early topic of the EU, and we're currently seeing various projects linking digitalization and sustainability, like the Horizon Europe project and the European missions. One of these European missions aims to help a total of 100 cities achieve climate neutrality by 2030 through digitalization. All these strategies and frameworks refer to digitalization or digital applications. However, public administration is really the focus. The research environment of the twin transition is thus quite complex and appears as an ongoing dynamic process. This process continues as based on various components and frameworks. The relevance of the twin transition is widely recognized, and there are therefore isolated projects and individual approaches. Various strategies and bodies deal with the topic and address it. The European twin transition is also the subject of academic debates and discussions, particularly in the context of the question of effectiveness, that is, whether sustainability is actually achieved through digitalization and what implications this has for the development of the EU. In some cases and under some circumstances, disparities and inequalities may even be enhanced. Linkage between digitalization and sustainability tends to occur selectively rather than systematically and comprehensively. Research is also often selective in this area. In addition, the sustainability effects of digitalization are assessed differently. Some studies even conclude that the current forms and logics of digitalization may worsen existing sustainability problems. Other studies take a more optimistic view and attribute high value to indirect effects, behavioral changes, or scaling. Public administration, however, is rarely the focus of these considerations and is more often subsumed under the broader area of politics and digitalization of politics. In operational implementation, weaknesses can be also identified in the European twin transition process. The many flagship projects and different frameworks lead to a very heterogeneous implementation of the twin transition. The idea is not implemented and considered consistently across all levels of administrative hierarchy. One contribution also criticizes the omission of ecological sustainability in the European AI regulation via the IA Act. Therefore, a need for further governance and tools that make the twin transition truly tangible. Planning security must be ensured and climate and environmental data must be used in line with their potential. There is also a need for further insights regarding innovation potential and desirable solutions and systems. Furthermore, ways should be identified to bring the twin transition into broader impact and enable strategic ensuring based on the flagship projects. Questions of justice and trade-offs between digitalization and sustainability must be made on a case-by-case basis. When universal principles or standards can be identified, they should be applied and institutionalized at the appropriate level. Now turn to our chosen approach and the methodology with which we have implemented the presented goals and embedded them in the context of the twin transition. And our policy research with the perspective of administrative informatics in the sense of our interdisciplinary approach, we first chose a visual approach and created a new integrated policy cycle. We then compared the resulting changes in policy making to the previous analog approach and illustrated them in a table. In this way, the desired accessibility was to be enabled and established through a concrete application of the heuristic to the twin transition. However, we did not want to build a completely new heuristic approach, but to build on the insights of previous considerations. We therefore looked at existing frameworks such as the multiple streams approach, the punctuated equilibrium theory, the advocacy coalition framework, and the policy cycle. Based on this, we wanted to develop, contextualize, and visualize our new idea of the new integrated framework. Evaluating the application should serve to assess the results and the limitations. On this, we then choose the policy cycle. Especially because of the policy cycle and the associated division of the policy making into the phases provides a basis for the systematically capturing the changes. The focus is therefore on capturing the changes in policy making that occur on the basis of a digital state. Changes thus become visible in a categorized and systemized way. On the one hand, this creates an entry point, while on the other hand, it is not the reality of policy making or how it's actually happening. The actual course of policy making rarely appears to be identical, but rather individual and dynamic. This means that we then think about new eras of application that could arise in order to link digitalization and sustainability. A categorizing perspective also allows for classification and distinction. The establishment and already frequent application of the policy cycle also enables a clear classification of the limitations and possibilities of the proposed heuristic, which is based on the policy cycle. To appropriately incorporate other existing findings, we naturally also dealt with other papers in the literature review. For example, the integrated perspective of von Lucke and Golasch, which integrates the open government into the policy cycle and shapes a public administration perspective on policy making. We also included the considerations of the integration of big data into the policy cycle, which were presented by Höchtel et al. And incorporated them into our reflection. In particular, the insights into continuous and data-based evaluation, monitoring, and assessment of political measures through digital systems were taken up. The integration of AI into the policy cycle, which was undertaken by Valle Cruz et al., was also considered and contextualized. Fundamental considerations on policy making, such as this by Manazir or Brickman and Davis, were also included. Reflections by Howlett et al. On the other frameworks were taken into account and are primarily included in the considerations of the policy cycle and other frameworks. The policy cycle is, of course, also subject to relevant criticism. The criticism dates back quite far and arose relatively early after its application. The criticism ranges from the frequency of actual application in practice to critics that fundamentally question the epistemic value. The cycle is seen more as a teaching than a research method, and thinking in categories is considered outdated. Limitations can, of course, also be a condition or strategy for certain epistemic intentions. One can critically ask for the policy cycle to what extent an ideal typically representation is useful. What legitimacy results both for a highly realistic and the ideal typical construction of the heuristic. We therefore had to incorporate these previous findings and bring them into an integrated perspective of the twin transition. So finally, we come to the results. These are, of course, not only the most exciting part of the presentation, but also always subject of critical review and therefore also show the limitations of the contribution. The result is shown in this graphic, in which the policy to be examined and the process to be analyzed can be inserted in the middle. The cycle or process is to be understood as an ideal, typically entry point, and in the analysis of real processes, the nonlinearity of policy making should be considered, in that policy making process may proceed, begin, and or be structured differently. Each phase contains specific application examples within the yellow boxes. This creates the opportunity to systematically reflect on the potential changes to a sustainability policy based on a digitalized administration. On the other hand, modern application examples can be assigned to different or several classic phases. This raises the question of relevance of the categories and classification. This structured approach is intended to offer a systematic perspective on questions of policymaking in the context of linking digitalization and ecological sustainability, and to explore possibilities of changes empirically or conceptually. However, the analysis of the categorized assessment and data in this integrated perspective should always follow the presented integrated approach and be interdisciplinary, dynamic, and flexible. The concrete effects of these application examples are made visible through the table included in the paper and are also described in text form. The full table, of course, cannot be presented here, but the main insights can when comparing how the table in our paper contrasts policy making in a classical policy cycle approach with our integrated approach from the perspective of administrative informatics, it becomes clear that classic policy making takes place on a paper rather than digitally. Applications, systems, and methods are more analog and linear than dynamic and flexible. Moreover, policy making in the classical sense is based on a reactive intention, since various concerns, needs, events, disasters, or conditions require action and lead to policy intervention. Forward-looking, anticipatory, and partly data-driven approaches are also in use in the real actions of public administrations in Europe, but digital logic would exclude or handle many still existing processes and analog procedures differently. Data-based and continuous adjustments in their analog form are often based on deadlines, recurring procedures, or targeted data collections. An integrated perspective on policymaking in the context of the digitalized administration would assume continuous data flows, nonlinear processes, and networked systems. Data silos or purpose-bound data collections would not be the rule but the exception, and questions about the most efficient and effective decision could be supported by networked systems and real-time data. Policy changes fundamentally through these perspectives and other views on the implementation and control of policy making are raised. The parameters of policy making are visible different and thus affect the actual possibilities of administrative and governmental action. Naturally, challenges and criticism also arise at the same time. Applying our heuristic, the volatility and influence of data and its quality must always be considered. Practical challenges are also to be expected in a digital state due to the quality, availability, usability, and interoperability of data. Machine-generated reports, suggestions, and predictions will not also be able to fully represent reality. Non-measurable factors, data protection, distortion, and bias will lead to faulty outputs and carry the risk of being underestimated. The emergence of a technocratic problem understanding that sees climate change as a purely technical issue would also be a critical challenge. Issues such as cybersecurity, complexity, familiarity, and readiness for application are also to be regarded as challenges of a digital administration in the context of policy making for the twin transition. Administration is thus a relevant actor in climate policy and also changes policy making through digitalization. There is a lack of usable applications across the broad and consistent strategies for all federal levels. We are able to identify many changes and the resulting opportunities but also challenges through our heuristic in the context of the twin transition. The categorization based on the policy cycle enables a systematic view to answer the question of what is changing, but the question of how it's changing remains a subject for further and deeper investigation. The heuristic interprets changes in policy making as a dynamic process that can be categorized to gain insights, but in reality never occurs in isolation. Changes in policy making are difficult to predict and depend on many contextual factors. Risks, therefore, also cannot be comprehensively identified. This leads to the limitations of the contribution. These are mainly derived from the limitations associated with the policy cycle. Reality proceeds differently than categorizing models. The model asks more about what is changing, although the questions of why policymaking is changing due to digitalization are part of administrative informatics. The proposed model delivers the analysis of the why only through its application rather than its first glance. Some factors and influences, such as path dependencies, belief systems, institutions, and threat systems, may be underestimated in their impact. I would like to sincerely thank you for your attention, and I'm pleased about the acceptance of this contribution and the proceedings of the conference. Feel free to follow or subscribe the Institute's newsletter.